Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third and final session of the day. I'm Peter Maravellis, and on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to begin our session with an acknowledgement. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to stand as witness and offer our respect to those who have been stewards of the land for many centuries. Our three sessions today have been celebrating the wonderful new book by Jeff Deutsch titled In Praise of Good Bookstores, published by Princeton University Press. We have used the book as a template with which to explore the trade that many of us love so dearly and that has been such a huge part of our lives. Our final panel talk today is called The Future of Books, the Building of Communities. We ask ourselves, how is the trade changing and how are booksellers adapting? How have bookstores brought communities together and what is their promise for the future? The session will be moderated by Jeff Deutsch himself. As mentioned in our earlier session, Jeff is one of this country's great booksellers. He is the director of Chicago's Seminary Co-op Bookstore, which is in 2019, he helped incorporate as one of the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. Jeff is going to be joined today by Jamie Kalven. Jamie Kalven is an award-winning writer and human rights activist. He is a Southside native and founder of the Invisible Institute, which received a 2001 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Also joining us for this session is Elizabeth Branch Dyson, the Executive Director for Sociology, Education, and Jazz Studies and Assistant Editorial Director at the University of Chicago Press. And also with us is Judy Hottensen, who is Vice President and Associate Publisher at Grove Atlantic Press, a wonderful friend of many years to City Lights and to many of us in the trade. And finally, our fourth panelist is Christie Henry, the Director of Princeton University Press, who has spent nearly 30 years in support of the mission of University Press Publishing. So such a great honor to have such an esteemed group together in one place today. Before we begin, please note that we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of In Praise of Good Bookstores. We might have a little time at the end for a Q&A, so drop your questions, your comments, praise into that aforementioned chat function. So join us in welcoming Jeff Deutsch and our dear friends and colleagues to this final session. Jeff, once again, congratulations. Everyone, welcome to the virtual City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to Peter and City Lights and Paul Yamazaki for hosting this day of conversation about the future of the bookstore. And in addition to being one of the best bookstores in the world, also to have the vision, to be this visionary about what we do and how important this work is really inspiring. So thank you, Peter. I'm actually going to begin by reading a little bit from the book, just a couple of brief passages to give a bit of context as to why we're having this conversation, in particular, why this incredibly esteemed panel has come together to discuss some of the ideas and think about, with me and with you, think about the ways in which bookstores help build and create communities and how we might be able to continue to do that in the future. One of the ideas in the book, it really speaks to the ways in which the bookstore itself is not a retail environment, it's a cultural institution, and that the work of the bookseller is not buying and selling. It's really about things like filtration, selection, assemblage, and enthusiasm. Those are the areas that are discussed in the book, and that discernment itself is the primary quality of the good bookseller. So I'm going to read just a few brief passages from the community chapter, which is the fourth chapter of the book. The Seminary Co-op Bookstore, writes the prolific author Cass Sunstein, is not merely a bookstore, it is a community. The sociologist Morris Janowitz, who helped finance the original Powell's bookstore, believed in bookstores because he believed in community, and bookstores built community. Sunstein, on a similar tip, thought the co-op was analogous to a great city, as Jane Jacobs memorably described it, full of life-altering surprises and unknown treasures. And whenever you turned a corner, you never knew what you would see. Sunstein and Janowitz both understood that a good bookstore reflects its community, but an exceptional bookstore both reflects and creates its community. Jamie Kalven, who is with us today, the firstborn son of the legal scholar Harry Kalven Jr., joined the co-op in 1978. In the late 1980s, wanting to document the creation of his community, Kalven began work on a book that, in depicting a community, quote, by way of the bookstore, would provide a portrait of a village of readers. Kalven profiled the vast cross-section of the store's customers, including those he described as children just learning to read, exiled intellectuals, adult illiterates, great scholars at the frontier of their field, celebrated writers and passionate readers of all ages and backgrounds. He was convinced that a key to understanding a community, in this case, his community on the south side of Chicago, was understanding the citizens of the bookstore. While this might seem like a disparate group, they are all a certain type of intellectual ambler. Their thoughts roam while browsing, carried through the store by their shuffling feet. They scan the shelves in some sort of focused meditation. They recognize each other as they gather books they've never heard of and would have never imagined they wanted if they had heard of them. They surprised themselves in realizing this was just the sort of book they were hoping to find. Something there is in the flow to the sight of things, as Whitman says, that provokes it out of the soul. And these amblers trust the intuitions that arise while wandering the stacks. The Good Bookstore serves as one such place to hold explicit and tacit public conversation. Whether a reader engages in a dialogue with the bookseller or another patron over a book or a selection of books in which they share an interest or through which they sort through different perspectives, gathers with others to listen to an author speak of their work, or, as is commonly experienced, finds that the engagement with the books alone provokes an internal dialogue, a shuffling of hunches, assumptions, and prejudices, bringing texture and insight to the far reaches of our ignorance. The ability to question our own beliefs, to dwell in uncertainty, empathy, or curiosity, to pursue knowledge, beauty, and meaning unstintingly so that we might make our best attempt at understanding, and to continually put ourselves in spaces that will challenge, not just echo our assumptions, is an act of citizenship as much as it is its own individual reward. In the bookstore, one had, quote, an impression of the wholeness of intellectual discourse, Jamie Kalven writes, a healing of the splintering of discourse that has taken place within universities, acknowledging that the books themselves are often at war with one another, arguing stridently in the strongest of language and with the highest of stakes about truth and consequences. There remains something restorative about the bookstore itself. As Kalven writes, the place that houses all these contending visions and impassioned quarrels stands in its quiet, cheerful, serious way for the possibilities of understanding and conciliation. There is something to glean of the totality of human experience in a space comprising its varieties. The constellation composed by the good bookseller serves as a harmonizing force. Thank you, Jamie, for those beautiful words. And I'm so thrilled to have this group here. So we have three very esteemed and accomplished publishers, and then Jamie, who is an author as well as a community builder and was a tremendous inspiration for the book. And so I think I want to start by just asking the panel to share a thought about how bookstores themselves have inspired and informed your work. And maybe Christie, you can kick us off.
Sure, I'd be glad to, although it's pretty humbling to follow those words. And as one who's happily ambled through many stores, they've always been kind of a key point of wayfinding for me in life. Something I think about a lot as a publisher in bookstores is this sort of unspoken alchemy of collaboration that exists when you cross the threshold of a bookstore. There is this amazing unfolding of collaboration that I think people aren't even aware of, that there's collaboration between publishers, between the booksellers, between authors and readers. We all meet on the pages, we meet on the shelves, and there's both intention and serendipity in that space. And so I think that, to me, bookstores the different forms of collaboration take place and take shape in so many different unique ways, magical ways. And that's what I think about the alchemy of it, depending on the community you're in, the place you're in, the stage you are when you walk into it, the stage you are when you exit that shelf and that room. It's a site of collaboration, human collaboration. And that to me is always inspiring.
Excellent. Elizabeth?
Well, I would like to talk about my experience at the Seminary Co-op in particular, which I always enter with two hats on my head. One as an editor, a competitive, jealous, envious, desirous editor, and as a delighted reader. So for those of you who have not yet had the pleasure of going to the Seminary Co-op, let me describe to you the mythic front table that Jeff talks about in the book with a capital F and a capital T, and that is no accident, friends. So for book lovers like all of us on this call today, it is a gluttonous feast. It's a long and wide wooden plank covered in stacks of new or newish books that the booksellers at the Seminary Co-op have carefully curated for our refined and varied reading palates. There's a new translation of ancient philosophy right next to art history, across from a timely work of controversial political science and an anthropological take on the city. There are books that I've seen advertised in the NYRB or in publishers' emails, and there are also books that I've never heard of, but someone at the co-op knew that I would like to hear of it, so there it is. And here's where the jealous professional comes in. So every now and again, I look at the table with a jolt of delight and suppress a squeal, because right there is one of the books that I worked on, and I touch it, I pat it gently, I eyeball the size of its stack, wondering if the fact that there are only a few means a lot have been sold or only a few were ordered in the first place. And then I take it in relation to its neighbors, that giant biography on one side, that pretty scholarly philosophical treatise on the other. But I walk away with a real pep in my step. I love to think about the curating work that the booksellers do at the bookshop, both for my work as an editor, but for my joy and development as a thinker and reader in the world. I could go on at great length, but that front table says so much about what a great bookstore can do for editors like me, for publishers, but especially for readers like all of us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I appreciate hearing the competitive piece of it, which is, of course, the truth of how some of us do engage with the space. So, Judy, let's stick with the publishers, if that's okay. And I'd love to hear a perspective from you before we move into Jamie's perspective.
Well, I agree with Elizabeth 100% on the walking in, and my eyes immediately scan for Grove Atlantic titles, but then I want to read that book. I want to read that book. So we get diverted. I think as a publisher, we spend a lot of time thinking about readers, and we don't have the resources to reach those readers as well as we do when we deal with booksellers. And it's a fairly enviable job I have to be able to visit bookstores, travel around, see what the stores are doing, how they feel, what books they're featuring, what's their size. And across that sort of adventure, I have also that enviable job of meeting so many booksellers and being able to talk to them about books. And I feel like there's so much in this book about, especially in the community section, about the relationship to, the bookstore to the reader. And there's a lot of, behind the scenes relationships with publishers and booksellers. And it's just so fun to be able to talk to people and to try to present books, as sort of unemotional as we can. But we're constantly thinking about, what would this bookseller like to, what would you like to read, Jeff? We've had some really amazing conversations. And so I just want to stress that we are all in such an enviable position being in this business. And we are so dependent on the bookselling community, the independent bookselling community, especially from my vantage point of being an independent publisher.
Thank you so much, Judy. And and for those who might not know the business as well, like we think about university presses and some of the larger publishers, and we have one of the great independent publishers here in Grove Atlantic, which started, of course, 100+ years ago with Atlantic Press, and then Grove is one of our great publishers. So thank you, Judy, for joining. Jamie, you have a different perspective because you're coming at this as a community builder, and I wouldn't have written the book without you. And I want to share just a very brief anecdote, if I may, about the work that you did. So you were actually working on a book. You've published books before. You're working on some books now, and you were a journalist as well. That was thinking about the bookstore, and you were so generous to allow me to look at your notes and read through how you'd been thinking about this work, and it informs the book quite a bit. So maybe you can share a little bit about again how bookstores have inspired and informed your work, and then I want to ask you a question about that project as well.
Sure. So, I mean, when I think of entering the bookstore, and again, I'm talking about the Seminary Co-op, there were a couple of suggestive things said by Christie and Elizabeth. First, that sense of this dense weave of collaboration that is sort of invisible, but so powerfully present. And I know when I come to the bookstore, I come with multiple impulses. One is actually just restorative, to be in touch with something that nourishes me deeply. And I'm not even sure what name to give that, but it's entering in a space where that is available to me. And there's actually an analogy that occurred to me when Christie was talking about collaboration, which is, a community garden with lots of plots can be very hard to kind of make sense of. You drive by it in different seasons, it can look kind of scraggly. But in fact, a community garden is an incredible institution of civil society, because all of these different sensibilities have intensely cultivated their plots. And so you can, in a certain frame of mind, step into a large community garden when nobody's there and feel something just kind of emanating from the site. The bookstore does that. And clearly the curatorial function, as Christie said, is central, and the sensibility of a great bookseller, and it's embodied by the front table for all of us, for all of us in Chicago. So the other thing, though, and you mentioned, pardon my voice, I'm, principally in recent years, an investigative reporter caught up in all sorts of controversies in the city of Chicago. I actually come to the bookstore to get the news. I come to the bookstore in part to withdraw from the endless tsunami of unfiltered, often incoherent information that floods all of us from moment to moment, and to just sort of recalibrate and refocus and try to restore my connection to what really matters, what I should be thinking about. And finally, I would say I come with a sense of adventure, stepping over the threshold, in that I've always been sort of enchanted by the notion that for any one of us in a great bookstore, there is a book, there are multiple books that if we found them would be transformative, would change our lives, would bring us incredible delight. So an article I wrote, it frightens me to say 30 years ago, which was the seed of the book project that Jeff referenced. I described browsing as a cross between loitering and prayer. And I think there's that longing, there's that wishfulness that you bring into a bookstore as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jamie. I really appreciate that metaphor too. That's absolutely wonderful. Preach it. Right. This is a very religious group. You're going to find that a bunch of secularists are going to be sitting here talking about religion. So I hope the audience has an appetite for that. This is our religion. Elizabeth, maybe can you share a little bit about the difference so you spoke about as a reader and as an editor, but speak about like maybe how the bookstore itself informs your work as an editor and how you've thought about, how it's changed the way that you think about the acquisitions that you're making.
Yes, and I really, I just finished the book today. It was such a pleasure. And I was struck at how similar the work is that booksellers and editors do. You note that booksellers are professional enthusiasts and editors are as well. And booksellers do amazing weeding work, is the way you put it, the garden of the muses, but it's the garden of the muses in a fallen world. So there are lots of weeds. And booksellers are weeders. And I couldn't believe you didn't make a play on weeders and readers. But good readers need good weeders. But I was also thinking, but part of my job as an editor is to make sure that you have enough kinds of plants and flowers there in the garden. I felt humbled thinking about my responsibility to make sure there's not, even in that great variety of books at the store, that there's enough kinds of diverse voices and points of view and primacy of data. And editors have a lot of responsibility to bring that forth. And for a long time, it was controlled by the same kinds of people. And I really was finding myself thinking about that so much while reading the book, and makes me feel even more competitive to have more books on the front table.
That's excellent. One of the things that was clear for anyone in the audience who has been to multiple sessions today, that there's a tremendous community also within the industry. And Judy is somebody who's built so much community and so much camaraderie, but has also done it from New York, right? Which is obviously where so much publishing happens, but not all of it. And have really made a concerted effort to bring disparate communities together that are not just New York. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've thought throughout your career about building community within the industry and then bringing it out to the reader.
Well, I think that's a really good point about New York, because I moved there 40 years ago or more to be in the capital of publishing, right? And to be at the place at the center of the universe. And it's certainly changed in a lot of ways, and it's really refreshing. And I think throughout my career, I made many attempts to move to other cities, because it's like, well, maybe I could live somewhere else. But I do think that, we try really hard to continue to preach our independence, right? We're a medium-sized publishing company and we compete with the big houses on so many levels, but we try to maintain our sense of community by publishing books that are, that we can afford to publish and that we can sell to a diverse group of people. And that just means, not only geographic, but just different kinds of audiences and everything else. So we work really hard to publish, debut authors that wouldn't have a voice in other places necessarily, or wouldn't be, able to be on a list of a publisher that's sort of prominent in New York City. But we look very much outside of New York. And I think, just what I was saying earlier about our search for readers, we found that finding books that we can base in other places besides the New York publishing scene, where we can, go to the bookseller. Really, that's what we do. And we find this, this community that will take ownership of a book in a lot of ways. And so whether it's a book of translation or it's a book, a regional, it's a book about the Civil War set in North Carolina, which we published Cold Mountain all those years ago. It was the independent bookstores that we really relied on, that community to build. And whether or not the big machine comes around, that's always nice too, but we start with that community. And they're, I think it just comes back to my point of, it's a really wonderful job I have to go traveling around and trying to find these excite these communities of people. But
Right, absolutely. Well, and I love hearing the way you speak of the booksellers themselves and helping to create the excitement around a book. You mentioned Cold Mountain as an example. And also, I mean, there's a tremendous catalog that you have of some of the best literature that has been produced in this country over the last 100 years. And and thinking about the role of the bookseller, and again, one of the primary, really the only argument of the book is that we are not looking at bookstores and booksellers clearly, right? We're seeing, we're calling them retail environments. We're thinking about how cheaply can we get a book, let's say, how quickly perhaps, and that's really not the purpose and role of a bookstore or a bookseller. And clearly, publishers on this panel see it that way. Christie, you're focusing on university presses, but also you think about the broader publishing community, you serve on the board of the Association of American Publishers. Speak a little bit to how you see the role of bookseller. Obviously, we're not just retailers, other people can sell books. What are the things that you see in the profession of bookselling?
Yeah, I mean, as I've already said, critical thought partners for publishers. And I think you've just come through a peer review process as an author, right? You've lived through that combination of generosity of expertise meets humility, right? And all in the interest of making a more impactful book.
For the audience, can you explain peer review?
Peer review is, right. So peer review is essentially we as university press publishers seek readers who have expertise in the earliest stages of works as they're at proposal stage, ideas stage, and then as they evolve into manuscripts, we send those materials out to reviewers who give us words of advice, and that's where the generosity of expertise comes in. Every reader is asked to essentially channel their expertise toward the positive impact of the work they're reviewing. Sometimes it's not always positive, but in its best spirit, it's positive. And then at the same time, though, it's an exercise for authors in humility, because you can't really embrace the basic tenets of peer review unless you're open to that feedback. As a publisher, we can do the same at a larger scale across an entire list or even book to book. And you've heard me say this, Jeff, I very much believe that booksellers are peer reviewers. How you react to the books that we publish in the world is sharing the generosity of your expertise. It's met with our humility because we want to have impact. We want to do better. We know that as you curate lists and respond to books in every season, you're giving us expertise that we can then use to shape our program and shape our books going forward. So it's sort of a more meta level, but with the same ultimate mission. It's having something that is of enduring impact in the world.
Right. That's beautiful. It reminds me of actually a little bit about Jamie, like you mentioned the news, like coming in to get the news, and thinking about peer review for university presses, for instance, and how that process itself, can fight mis and disinformation. And also thinking about how journalism in the 20th century was the business model for it was sell advertising in order to support what is one of the most important institutions in a civic society. Jamie, in thinking about journalism and peer review and the work that you do as a long-form investigative journalist, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the way that you think that the role that the bookstore plays in society, and what is lost when we don't have models to support them.
Yeah, so if I understand the question and the direction of the question, this is such a distinct moment in terms of the society, the polity, public discourse, freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And a lot of institutions that we would look to uphold and embody those values, notably universities in many instances, have been pretty wobbly, in this era, to put it generously. And we also have increasingly a sort of political and media culture that is, at worst, really poisonous and toxic, and at best pretty chaotic and often miseducating just by virtue of volume and redundancy. So as I went back to that article of 30 years ago and was reflecting on all that has changed, in bookselling, bookstores, publishing over those 3 decades. I mean, that was a time when bookstores were first and foremost the place you went to get books.
Right.
Now there are alternative ways of performing that function, which obviously is hugely destabilizing for the business model of an independent bookstore. That said, I think in some ways these other functions, which certainly require selling books to sustain them, have emerged as being yet more important in this era. So I'm thinking back to some of the language you quoted about this welcoming, hospitable institution that contains on its shelves warring books,
Right.
argument after argument, contention over every possible issue or question, but does it in a space that holds the promise of understanding, reconciliation, learning from one another. That is so extraordinarily rare in our culture at the moment, that I think, I'm not sure quite how to, beyond describing it and observing it, how to promote it. But I think the preciousness of a good and a great bookstore in the current moment is, despite the precariousness of the business model, the preciousness of the cultural institution has never been greater.
Well, and thinking about, again, this analog journalism and recognizing that you've established a not-for-profit that focuses on governmental transparency, and you work specifically around police data and gathering information, but also have done quite a bit of long-form investigative journalism, and recognizing that model of selling advertising in order to support it never made sense. And of course, you've been you've won all of the major awards really in journalism, and to think about that as a way to sell socks or merchandise through advertisements or legal firms or whatever that newspapers used to run the ads for, it just seems like had we built it deliberately, we never would have built it that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Well, and, I want to maybe turn it, Christie, to you to talk a little bit then about the role of the bookseller. When we talk about it's not just about selling, a lot of it has to do with citizenship and literary citizenship. And you're somebody who you serve on boards, you work globally, you think about not just bookstores, but also what the environment could be around inquiry and how we think about the models for not just peer review, but also conduct and what it means to publish books that are of great import, that are going to last, even if they don't make money. Any thoughts that you'd like to share about literary citizenship, bookish citizenship, and what it means to be in this industry as someone who is trying to create a better world?
Yeah. And make sure there are many more people of the book in that world. I think that's something that every one of us on this call shares. I mean, I think as listening to Jamie, I kept coming back to the word purpose, right? I think that's where it's not a function, it's a purpose. And I know we don't necessarily want to get into sort of religious terrain, but there is like a spirituality around, I think, what all of us feel as we enter these places and as we spend our lives creating communities around the people of the book. I think Elizabeth mentioned this too. One of the things that I think many of us are appreciating and purposely moving toward is a community that is much more inclusive. And that is both those who are writing the books, those who are publishing the books, those who are curating those collections for the stores and stacks. That's, I think, how we get more people of the book. And I think that's also where we've seen the great benefit of partnerships across different communities of people of the book. And I'm hoping that we can continue to point a lot of purpose toward that globally. And I think it also ties back to what Jamie was saying, the more people who can enter those spaces and see those disagreements on the shelves, the better we will all be in terms of forming responsible citizenry and responsible conversations. But we have to make sure that the works themselves are available, that the stores and communities are available. And I think that's, again, that's part of the purpose of what we're all doing. And particularly at a mission-driven press, I realize it's a luxury. We have the luxury of thinking in terms of impact in a way that not all do. But I think that's also that luxury we share with a lot of booksellers too. They're there for a mission.
Right. Well, and the luxury really, it feels like a luxury, but should it? And I think that part of the argument for us is saying maybe, and you've done a great job of just making it happen, regardless of what the resources are. But why? And with journalism too, should this be a luxury or is this a necessity? And we, I was talking with I was with a bunch of booksellers a couple of days ago, New England booksellers, and we were talking about vocational awe and the idea that vocational awe, which is a big thing in libraries and in publishing and in bookselling, which means that you love your job so much, and that vocational awe sustains you in a way that you don't need the money, and that's how it's talked about. And it's like, well, why can't we have vocational awe and decent remuneration, right? Yeah. And why can't we actually have these sorts of conversations in ways that professionalize the work that we're doing that's so critical for an educated populace? And so I want to turn it to you, Elizabeth, and I do want to just remind the audience that if there are any questions, please drop them in the chat. We will save time for them as we get closer to the end. Elizabeth, one of the things that, as far as I'm concerned, there's no better University Press editor in the country than you, and I've really watched what you've been doing around, for philosophy and sociology, and also then just bringing in voices. You recently published a found memoir of a voice from the South Side of Chicago. And Christie, you were talking about peer review, and Judy, and thinking about your list and like how incredibly accomplished and intelligent the authors on your list are. And I'm going to ask you a question about backlist here in a second. So, and speaking about the incredible list that you've all cultivated. But Elizabeth, for you, and thinking about your role as a acquisitions editor and a gatekeeper in a good way. We often use gatekeeper as a negative thing, but there actually is a reason that your work is so important and you're behind the scenes. Speak a little bit about what you're looking for to have that high of a quality of book published on your list, and what are the things that go into your decisions around making sure that a book hits the shelf and hopefully stays there for years or decades.
Well, you're totally embarrassing me. But I would like to answer this question in relation to the bookstore and the book that you just wrote, because I think they're very similar. So my favorite thing about your book, Jeff, is that basically it is an invitation to browse. The future of the bookstore lies in the invitation to browse. And the Seminary Co-op is in the heart of the University of Chicago's campus, which is a rarefied atmosphere, but it's a major institution in the Hyde Park neighborhood of the South Side of Chicago, which is a neighborhood known for its enormous diversity in a number of ways: race, class, age, level of education, language spoken. And it includes many people who are very accustomed to being followed and watched when they enter stores, who keep their hands out in the open all the time. They're deliberately made to not feel welcome, and who make a point of never browsing because it can be seen as suspicious behavior. So I feel like so much of my work, and your work too, as we think about the future of publishing and the future of the bookstore, is inviting so many more people in. Now, how do we get teenagers from Hyde Park High School to feel like the Seminary Co-op and 57th Street Books are places where they're welcome? And for those of you who, like me, love a good typology, Chapter 1 features this fabulous typology of browsers. My favorites there are the flunner, the town crier, the ruminator, the pilgrim, the idler. All of us will recognize ourselves in these various kinds of browsers. But the most important thing is feeling like not only are you allowed to browse, you are invited to browse. So I feel like a big part of my job is inviting in not just new voices to be speaking, but new ears to be listening. And a good bookstore plays a pivotal role in that.
Thank you. That is incredibly inspiring. And I appreciate that answer. And I think that there's something important about, and Jamie, you talked about this, the democratizing element and having, you know, again, there are gatekeepers in a bad way, the ways in which we don't have access. But there is also, again, and Elizabeth, forgive me if this is, and I can pass this along to Judy, but I do want to, you have such exquisite taste, and I think about the work that you do, including trying to call some of these things out. I mean, your list is filled with books about, you know, there's a wonderful book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, that speaks to the way in which the city of Chicago really underserved the South Side of Chicago through closing of schools in underserved communities. You have also books on philosophy that are written by professors at community colleges, and it's really about like how to live and what to do. It's not, you know, in a language that it's even someone who reads some philosophy I don't understand a word of it. When I open up some of these books on Heidegger or whatever, some of which you publish that are amazing, I'm sure, for the field, but I don't understand a word of it. What about that accessibility, and what about that quality?
I feel like I am not doing my work if I am not helping authors, scholars who really want to reach a broader audience to help them do that. And sometimes I just ask very simple questions. I'll circle whole parts. Todd May is a great example. He was one of the collaborators on the show The Good Place. And it was so much fun to work with him on 3 books. The last one was an idea that we came up with together, which I basically said, I just need to know how to, this book is called A Decent Life. And I said, I don't aim to be the very best moral person. I just want to be good enough. Can you give some sound philosophical guidance for pretty good living? And so much of my work there was to say, I don't know what you're talking about here. This part has gone on too long. I'm not interested anymore. But I'm doing that because I'm thinking of the reader. I'm thinking of the reader like me and you and everyone on this call, and your mother too, who maybe doesn't read the kinds of books you read. I will know I have succeeded if and when I can finally get my mother to read a book I've worked on from start to finish.
I love it. That's great. I actually want to, so Judy, I want to turn it to you, and I'm going to read a really brief piece from the book that actually quotes Paul Yamazaki, who's on the call. Yamazaki explains what's at stake when we don't allow a fair mellowing period. So we're talking about the amount of time it takes for a reader to find a book, and the mellowing period where a book sits on the shelf for a while. And thinking about books that have been published that are you know, what we call backlists, which are basically books that are older than a year or two. Paul says, so booksellers and publishers can't support the work of authors like Toni Morrison, quote, and this is Paul, whose first few books had sales under 5,000 copies, if we respond only to initial sales figures. This kind of thinking, Paul says, creates an industry where a young editor who discovers someone they think can be a future Toni Morrison has no chance of doing that author's 3rd or 4th book unless they have significant sales. And so, Judy, I mean, Grove Atlantic doesn't really necessarily think this way, but also has to think about the incredible backlist of the books that you've already carried. And every frontlist book is an aspirant to backlist. A lot of books are aspirants to become classics and things of that sort. Share a little bit about how you've thought about the list itself, and again, maybe the role bookstores might play in it, but not necessarily, even just as a publisher, what that process looks like for you.
Well, obviously, I mean, Grove has its amazing history, a tremendous, mission of free expression and freedom of speech and everything else that it was founded on all those years back by Barney Rossett. Our backlist is a huge part of our publishing program, whether it's Waiting for Godot or Confederacy of Dunces or William Burroughs or all of our magnificent backlist, and that just means way backlist, right? I think that as a publisher, we have moved with this with this movement in our books. And so we're trying to create more backlist books. But it just to the bookstore point, I have to stick there for a second, just that, the two stores that I'm looking at people now, City Lights and Seminary Co-op, are two bookstores where actually you can find our books in backlist. And it's a huge, problem. I mean, in that they can't be found in a lot of places. And your whole book, touches on this in all ways, that it's just how are people going to find these books that are so important and not just our books, everyone's books. So we continue to repackage them. We try to, and I know other publishers do too, but it's just keep them so that they can be reordered and re-looked at and re-featured and everything else. Adopted in schools and classrooms. I mean, our books are not textbooks at all, but they are used in a lot of university classes. But again, my enviable job is to look after our backlist. And whenever I'm trying to hire somebody or talking to somebody about my role, it's like, it is my most favorite thing about publishing books is looking at these books that have come before me and how to keep them being read. So, we rely on you guys in so many ways to keep these books flowing. Jeff, your store is just a magical place to encounter some of these things. And, publishers do not like to take books back. And in our industry, unfortunately, books can be returned. So it's painful to see, books come back. We know that it happens with Frontlist, but with the backlist, it's our bread and butter. That's all I can really say. We love a big Frontlist title. We work hard for that. It's our goal, but it is really to create it for the future so that it lives on a backlist in your bookstore on a shelf.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And there's something about discovery that is so obvious to those of us in the industry who think about why have a bookstore at all, and recognizing that so many readers can't discover books obviously online. There's a lot of media for books that are coming out that might be of the moment, but what about the books that came out 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 2,000 years ago? How do you discover those books? And so we're getting close to concluding here, and I'm going to take Harry's question about practical suggestions for me for turning bookstores from retail institutions to cultural institutions. I think that the first thing that needs to happen is an acknowledgement of the model is broken, and in order to create good bookstores, you need great booksellers. And in order to have great booksellers, you need to pay them and have professionals. And we don't have a model right now where there is a professional bookselling track. Paul Yamazaki, who's on the call, and I are very lucky to have had a career in bookselling, and it's not common. It's not common that one could stay in the industry, grow with the industry, and be seen. I mean, even to have an idea of actually writing a book or anything to speak about it. And Paul is working on his own book that'll be out next year. Like the idea that we can do that work, it's not common, and we're an exception that currently proves a rule that we were trying to overturn. The practical suggestions, I think, are, and I had a third piece that I was going to read. I decided against it, but there's a section in the book called "We Are All Booksellers Now," and I don't have practical suggestions beyond what we've done, which is we've become a not-for-profit bookstore whose mission is bookselling, and we're trying to build that model where we're funding the browse itself, because that's our product. We're not trying to sell books. Our store happens to lose money every time we sell a book. And we have lost money for years as a store because we've tried to make it into a retail model, but it's not that. It actually is a cultural institution. And if we all as a community and as a society shift the understanding of the purpose of a bookstore from retail to cultural institution, and then invest in it in that way, and say, Judy, for instance, example of having us as enthusiasts to not just support new books that might not get as much attention, but also backlists, or in thinking, Christie, about us as peer reviewers. And Jamie, you had talked about the way in which we bring, it's a space that brings so many diverse people together. Like, why don't we fund it in that way as opposed to leave it to the bookseller to figure out a retail model that frankly is only going to lead them to sell books that we're not talking about and stock merchandise like sweatshirts and socks and greeting cards, which are amazing. Bookstores that have those are great, but that there's an economic necessity that in order to run a bookstore, one needs to bring those in. That's highly problematic. And so we're trying to build something that starts with the strength of bookstores themselves, the fact that communities are enhanced by those bookstores. So it's not incumbent upon the bookseller, it's incumbent upon the community and all of us to build these spaces and build models for them. And we want to begin with the strength and not try and shoehorn what we do so well into an existing model that we inherited from traditional retail. It just makes no sense. And again, I think journalism is a great analog where we're all like, what's the answer to figure out long-term investigative journalism and finding truth across the aisle? And Jamie, you're talking about expression and what it means to like have that sort of those debates that can actually help us come to a common ground. That's incumbent upon all of us. Okay, we are coming close to time. Anyone have any final bits of wisdom or book recommendations or bookstore recommendations or anything you want to share before we conclude?
I have something to share. So in Jeff's book in chapter 5, he says, the sages taught that 7 matters are concealed from us. And the 5th one of those is in what way we might fulfill our calling. And all of us on this call, I think, have done a pretty good job of figuring out what our calling is and working to fulfill it. I want to get books out there that change people's minds and maybe even change the world. And Jeff wants to make sure that makes it into your hands. And also that bookstores, independent bookstores, are doing the work they're meant to do.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think that's a great note to end on. Peter, I don't know if you want to take us out.
Yeah, wow, what a day. We have covered so much ground. I mean, so much to think about, and really thank you all for your thoughtfulness, for your experience. I mean, it means a great deal. I mean, it's so heartening to have such great discussion. So thank you, Jamie Kalven, Elizabeth Branch Dyson, Judy Hottensen, Christie Henry, and of course, Jeff, you brought us all together. Congratulations once again. A special shout out to Maria Whelan of Princeton University Press for all her efforts in making today happen. Our wonderful Princeton rep, Patricia Nelson, also Clancy over at Seminary for all her efforts. It's been a team effort, and I am certainly proud to be in the orbit of just this wonderful group of book people. So thank you all. I want to remind you, we've posted links in the chat of your Zoom dashboard with which you may still purchase copies of In Praise of Good Bookstores. And today's event has been made possible by the support of the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events, our publishing programs, the educational outreach we do. It's all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So wherever you may be, we hope today's program has inspired you to run down to your local bookstore, to offer them your support. Moreover, we hope it's inspired you to indulge in the great pleasures of browsing, the joy of discovery, and the building of community. So take care, everyone. Be safe, be well. We hope to see you all again very, very soon. Jeff, I'm going to give you the last word.
If you haven't been to a bookstore recently, it's magical. Go to any bookstore, any book space, libraries, wherever, and just let yourself, don't look for anything particular, let yourself go. So thank you, Peter, and thank you, City Lights.